Okay, so this is the second episode of Ex-Tankie Podcast, where I talk with experts about foreign affairs, the phenomena of war crimes and genocide denial, and leftist foreign policy. So the purpose of this podcast is to explore common tankie or alt-left talking points. So as an interviewer, I'm planning on playing devil's advocate and taking on the role of a tankie so we can understand why their arguments don't hold. So in this episode, I'll be exploring the propaganda campaign by the Chinese government to cover up what's happening to Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. So I'm joined today by Darren Byler, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Asian Studies at the University of Colorado, and has written for many different publications. So just to begin, Darren, I was wondering if you could discuss the kind of research you do surrounding the topic of Chinese government oppression of ethnic and religious minorities.
Sure. So I'm an anthropologist, which means I'm trained in sort of qualitative research methodologies, which means that I interview people, I hang out, I build friendships with people over a long period of time, in order to kind of understand what their life world is like, what their social life is like. So in the context of Xinjiang, I lived there for 2 years, first in 2011 and then another year in 2014 and 15. And then went back again in 2018 for a shorter research trip. And so I could track people's changes over time. I got to know people really well. So this sort of thing it's more like a sort of, it's kind of like fancy journalism, I guess, because it's like long form. You spend a lot of time with people and you're just focused on one topic for years. But it is qualitative, so there's a lot of interviews, and then you have to kind of test what people are saying against what other people are saying in order to kind of get a ground of truth as to what's actually happening in people's lives. So sometimes people think that what anthropologists do is just collecting anecdotes, like just some random stories, and it does sort of start that way, but it goes much deeper than that, because there's repeated interviews where you talk to this person over and over, and you kind of begin to uncover their life history. And then you talk to all of their friends and say, this person told me this. Is that how you remember it? You were there too. And so you can corroborate what the people are saying. So it's not just a bunch of random anecdotes. It's actually something that's built through a sort of systemic study of a network of people. Then you can also test what people are saying from one position, like for instance, Uyghurs, against what Han people are saying. They're living in really radically different worlds, maybe even in the same city, but they're not talking to each other. And so you can see, from their perspective, it looks this way. From this other person's perspective, it looks that way. And so then you can kind of see, where are the tensions in the society. So that's the kind of work I did and still do, but it's much more difficult to go to Xinjiang these days. So I haven't been there since 2018.
Okay, great, thanks. And I was listening to the interview you did on a Hong Kong radio station just this morning, and you spoke about how people there actually thought that you were Uyghur, right? So I guess that gives kind of an extra, or in some cases, that gives an extra sort of credibility to your research, that they didn't think you were just, because I think the other guy was accusing you as a Westerner if they were just telling you what you wanted to hear, but clearly that's not the case.
Yeah, I mean, there might be sometimes where they would tell me what they think I wanted to hear. But yeah, because I speak Uyghur and because I speak Chinese, there's certain ways that people assume that you're going to be positioned. So my Han friends would often assume that, of course I would agree with them if they say, Uyghurs are backward and that they're the main problem in Xinjiang. And so they would tell me, their perspective, because they thought, oh, this person speaks Chinese, he must understand that. But then Uyghurs, on the other hand, would think I might be interested in opposite perspectives. And then in many cases, they did assume I was Uyghur, at least initially. They thought maybe I was a Minkao Han, which is someone who went to a Chinese language school. And so my Uyghur was not perfect because I've been trained in Chinese. But they still assumed I was Uyghur. They thought maybe I was a city Uyghur because I was so pale and because I wore glasses. But they still thought I was a Uyghur.
Interesting. So I guess the next question I have is it right to claim as the Chinese Communist Party does, that Xinjiang is a hotbed for Islamic extremism?
No, I don't think it's a good way of framing the issue at all. Uyghurs are Muslim. There's around 12 million Uyghurs. And out of that population of 12 million, there are some that have been radicalized or have sort of extremist ideas, but they're a very small minority of that 12 million people. I would say that it's probably proportionate to most Muslim populations in the world. Like one way you could frame this is around what numbers of people went to Syria to fight in the Syrian civil war or to support the Islamic State. And we can see that the Uyghur population, the numbers of Uyghurs that went to Syria is pretty much proportionate to the numbers of UK Muslims that went to Syria or the number of French Muslims that went to Syria. And one interesting fact is that the Uyghurs were mostly fighting against the Islamic State and against the Assad regime, anywhere affiliated with al-Nusra, which is not necessarily a good organization. It's affiliated with al-Qaeda. But they weren't necessarily supporting the Islamic State. And they were pretty much there as mercenaries, because Uyghurs went to Turkey as refugees from China, fleeing China. That was their primary reason to leave. And when they arrived in Turkey, they couldn't find good work, and there was recruiters coming from Syria, some supported by the Turkish government, allegedly. And they were given job opportunities to go fight in Syria, and that's why they went. So they didn't necessarily go there even for ideological reasons, unlike UK Muslims or French Muslims. And so if we're doing that kind of comparison, we could think, well, maybe the Chinese response to the Uyghurs that have been radicalized should be something similar to what the French or the British have done, which is not to throw people in camps, not to target the entire population. Instead, it's to figure out why are these people being radicalized, and what could we do to provide a better way of life for people. Most of the violence in Xinjiang that's been caused by Uyghurs has been the result of local injustice. It's been the result of police brutality that they've experienced or their family members have experienced. It has to do with restrictions on religious practice, very normal forms of religious practice, like whether or not you should be able to veil yourself, whether or not you should be able to pray 5 times a day, those sorts of things. And so a lot of times what we're seeing is sort of spontaneous responses to police intervention in people's lives, not like organized attacks on civilians. There have been some organized attacks on civilians by Uyghurs, but there's really just a handful of them. One of the things that I think mitigates against Uyghurs, developing an insurgency is that they don't have any weapons. There's no guns available to them, and they don't even have the kind of equipment that other Muslim populations might have in other places. So the sort of threat, the level of threat, I think is actually significantly lower than in some other places in the world. So my sense is that there's other motives that are driving the Chinese state when it comes to deciding that they want to target the population as they have. And those have to do with wanting access to natural resources in the Uyghur region, and wanting to turn Uyghurs into sort of assimilated citizens who have kind of forgot about their Muslim identity.
Okay, great, thanks. So I guess the next topic I want to cover, I think this is one of the biggest objections to the reporting and everything that happens in Xinjiang, is people reference the 1 million figure. There are apparently 1 million or somewhere between 1 million and 2 million Uyghurs currently in camps. So tankies will often focus on this figure and try and pick holes in the research that has come to this estimate. And for good reason, because this research is referenced quite a lot. It's in the recent statement by 39 UN countries on human rights abuses carried out by the Chinese government. It cites credible reports of more than 1 million Uyghurs in camps. So I was wondering if I could, I'll give you some of the common kind of objections to this research, and you can tell me why you don't think that they stand. So the main one is that people claim that so the research by the Chinese human rights defenders, it only had a sample size of 8 to determine, and people say, how can you determine there are 1 million people in camps if it's only 8 people that you're interviewing?
Well, I mean, that is a really small sample size, and so we'd have to think of it as just a start in understanding the scale of what we're talking about. But it's also important to understand that these are 8 people that are positioned differently in this large space. So Xinjiang itself is the size of Alaska. It's a huge place, and these 8 different people that they interviewed were located in different communities, in different towns, different villages, different counties. And so what the interviewers were doing were asking people, how many households have been affected in your community? So it's a much larger scale sample than it first appears when you say 8 people, because we're talking about 8 communities. Still, it would have been better to have, multiple people from each community confirm what's going on in their community. But this, I think, should be thought of as like a beginning to understanding, how widespread it is, how systematic it is, and what kind of scale it might be at. But it's certainly not a definitive way of estimating the numbers, just the beginning. And I think most people took it to be that. There's much more evidence that came later, and we'll probably talk about that.
Okay, great. Yeah, I think that's part of the issue, is that when a researcher produces a study like this and says it's an estimate, people assume that they think that it's fact, that they know for certain this is the case, but it is just an estimate. So I guess the next point that's made is Iskatal TV is one of the main sources that's referenced. There was apparently a document from the Chinese Communist Party that was leaked to this channel, and that's one of the main pieces of evidence that I think Adrian Zenz used, and people try and argue that this channel is not reliable at all, because it's often given a platform to religious extremists.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I mean, there's some truth there. I don't know that much about that TV channel, but they're not necessarily trained journalists, and so they're reporting as well as they can, likely, and with a certain slant to what they want to present. The document itself is pretty detailed that they shared. It's just listing different communities and numbers of people detained. That it's just a spreadsheet basically. It's possible that someone could have taken the time to type up, all of those place names and then put in random numbers. That there is some potential there. But I think what Adrian and others were thinking about was how this matched up with what they were hearing from that other report, that previous estimate. Is it roughly similar or not? And it was. I think there's been some attempts to corroborate that report by calling police stations in the region. Radio Free Asia has done a lot of that kind of reporting. And they've confirmed it as well. But again, it's still just another sort of partial view. And I think it's not one that you should say, oh, then we know with absolute certainty that this is the number for sure. It's just another reference point.
Okay, great, thanks. And then I guess this is probably one of the most common arguments which is made in defense of the Chinese Communist Party, is pointing out that Adrian Zenz, who's one of the main researchers in this topic, has written some very controversial things in the past about feminism and topics like that, and people see him as something of a religious fundamentalist himself, and he's written about the end of the world. And so, why do you think that this doesn't undermine his research or the findings that he's come to?
Well, it does make people read him more critically, I think. He does have a past of, serving as a missionary, Christian missionary, I think in Tibet. And he's written books on eschatology, which is like Christian prophecy. He also has a PhD in anthropology, social anthropology. So he has some pretty rigorous training in the sort of methods that he's using, and he's been, published in many peer-reviewed journals. The work that related to Xinjiang has all been pretty rigorously peer-reviewed. So I think in that sense, it's pretty well founded. He's also quite transparent about his sourcing. He's almost exclusively using Chinese government sources. And if you take the time, you can go back and actually look at the sources that he's using. Everyone should be read critically, and it's important that people's work stand up to rigorous peer review. And for the most part, his work has done that. I think he understands that he's talking about something that's quite sensitive, that has a lot of implications for geopolitics and for this group of people in these groups of people in Northwest China. So I think he's trying to be quite careful. At the same time, just have to be really critical of how, read carefully. But I don't think that we should, necessarily dismiss him out of hand simply because of, aspects of his politics that we might not agree with. I think we have to take the research itself seriously.
Yeah, that's very true. And then, if you disagree with him as a person and his personal views, you can still look at the fact that it's been peer reviewed. Other people have reviewed the evidence that he's found and corroborated it. So it doesn't, even if he maybe has some troubling beliefs in other categories, he still happens to have come across very sound research. And then I think it's one other thing I found when I was researching this. I think it's kind of ironic how, the grey zone and websites like that, which make this argument that they're so concerned about apparently promoting a religious fundamentalist in Adrian Zenz, but then they've promoted, so Ben Norton, who works for the Grey Zone, retweeted a Han ethno-nationalist Twitter account that said things like the Turk is the eternal enemy of the Han genetic lineage, and said that the Jews were the reason that the Second World War was caused. So I just think it's ironic that these sources will regularly cite people like that, or I don't know, people who work for the AfD in Germany and cite them as or authoritative sources, but Adrian Zenz is considered completely out of the question as an authoritative source. So yeah.
Right.
Okay. And then, so is it true that this is the primary evidence that we have of Uyghur oppression? It seems that the Tankies make it out that this body of research is all we really have, and since they don't believe that there's anything to it, they completely dismiss it. So what other evidence do you think there is which provides pretty irrefutable proof that something bad is happening in Xinjiang, or maybe not irrefutable, but as sure as we can be?
Right. Well, I mean, it's other proof that builds and corroborates previous research, I would say, is how we should think about it. So, one sort of form of empirical evidence is, the view we can have from satellites of these camps being built out in space. We've documented, or researchers have documented, over 300 of them now. These are very large facilities. They are, obvious on the landscape and obvious in people's minds in these towns. One town that I've been researching recently has a population, the county itself has a population of around 200,000 people. And in the town that's next to the big camp that they built, it's I don't know, 100,000 or more. I don't know exactly what the population is of the town itself. The population of Uyghurs and Hui and Kazakhs that live in that county is like 15 to 20,000 people. But the camp that's there, has the capacity to hold between 7 and 15,000 people itself. So understanding that these camps primarily target Uyghurs and Kazakhs and Hui people, based on all the evidence we have from former detainees, it's clear that this is a really significant, that this camp is holding a really significant portion of the population of Muslims in this region. So imagine you live in that town and 7,000 at a minimum disappear. You would notice that these 7,000 people are gone. Everyone in the town knows that there's this huge new complex where people have been sent. And if you're Uyghur or Kazakh, you definitely know this, because it's so the probability of you having a family member in that camp is so high, that you would have to be completely, oblivious to not know that this camp is there. And this is being repeated throughout the entire region. So these things are this monster presence. I mean, I don't know what it's like in the UK, but in the US, like, we have prison towns where the prison is often out in sort of a rural area, and it's mostly holding urban, people from urban spaces that are sent out there. But many people that work in that town, they work in the prison. They're prison workers. It's like the industry of that town. And that's what's become the process, or the sort of industry in Xinjiang, is like the camp itself is now sort of driving the economy, not just with prison workers, but now with factories that are associated with the camp. So it's a huge aspect of daily life. So we can see it from the satellite imagery. We can see it in government data. We have these two really outstanding government documents that show with really precise detail how the camp system works. One of them was released by the New York Times. It was leaked to them. These are, verified documents that come from central leadership, from Xi Jinping, Chen Chuangguo, who's the party secretary of the region, describing, how they need to round up everyone that needs to be rounded up, and to show no mercy, and how the point system works, like how you should tell the children of the parents that are taken to the camp, how to explain to them why their parents were taken. It's explaining it in minute detail. Then we have this other document from Zhu Hailun, who is the deputy party secretary of the region. It's stamped, signed by his name, dated and stamped. This is how party documents are authenticated. It's numbered as well, so the person who actually received that document is likely in trouble because of it being leaked. And it's explaining, it's a manual for how the camps work, that they should be run like a prison, defended like a prison, run like a school. It's talking in graphic detail about the punishment system, about use and non-use of lethal weapons, all of these sorts of things. So we have that kind of information. We also have lots and lots of big contracts for the building of these things, how they're buying cattle prods, handcuffs, razor wire, all the sorts of things you need for a prison, not for a training center. And then on top of all of that, we have dozens of former detainee reports now, that mostly people that have gone to Kazakhstan, who are in the camps, who can talk in very detailed ways about their experiences in the camps, unpacking the timeline of how they went to the camp, but also the daily activities in the camp, the sort of incidents that stand out in their mind that keep them up, at night, even now. They can show you the scars on their bodies from beatings and things like that. On top of that, we have thousands of reports from from family members of detainees who've lost contact with their parents, or have been told by family members that your uncle was taken. There's just so many stories. And like, it might be one thing to say, oh, that person was just telling you what you want to hear. And there might be some truth in that, but when you hear 1,000 of them, and they match really clearly, and they're from all of these different places, the timelines match, at a certain point, the evidence really begins to outweigh the claims of this being exaggerated. There's just so much evidence now. At the same time, like, we can't get clear access to these camps, and why would we expect that we could? So anyway, people will still want to doubt it, but people always want to doubt that crimes against humanity are happening. It just doesn't mean that they're not. Like, in this case, we have a lot of evidence that they are.
Okay, great, thanks. So I guess my next question is, if there really is oppression of Muslims in China, then why are so many Muslim nations standing in support of China? So famously in 2019, the Organization of Islamic Cooperation sent in investigators to the region, and they apparently found that there's no evidence of oppression against Muslims.
Well, this speaks to my last point about how difficult it is to get access. I guess I can start there. So when diplomats or journalists are permitted to access the region, or they're invited to access the region, they're put on a tour of spaces that have been set up for their visit. They go to mosques where the people that are praying there are mostly elderly and have been recruited to be in the mosque for the visit. So they're not actually seeing the camp that's being reported by these former detainees, or that we can see from the satellites. They're always guided. They're never allowed to have open conversations with former detainees. There's always a handler in the room with them, and so actually being able to assess what's going on is difficult on the ground, especially if you don't have kind of the training you might need to do that kind of investigation. So that's one thing. The other thing is that many Muslim majority nations are dependent on China for trade. The Chinese economy is one of the largest in the world, and it's particularly important in the developing world, because that's where China has really placed its priority. The third thing is that the Trump administration is Islamophobic. It's on day one, or Trump himself campaigned on banning Muslims from the U.S., and he's followed through on that. He has an anti-refugee policy. The U.S. has also been responsible for the global war on terror that's displaced 37 million people. So there's many reasons why Muslim majority nations would be skeptical of claims from the U.S. The fourth thing is that many Muslim majority nations also have problems with human rights in their own countries. They also don't want people fighting for democracy in the streets, and so I think when they see another country cracking down on people that are viewed as dissidents, they see that as okay, and also as something they want to. They would not like the UN to intervene in their own states when they do the same. So these are authoritarian states that are helping other authoritarians in some ways. At the same time, I think many Muslims in those Muslim majority countries, more common citizens that are aware of what's going on in Xinjiang, are deeply appalled by it. We've seen large demonstrations in places like Bangladesh and Indonesia and Malaysia in support of Uyghurs. It's just that the leaderships in those countries are not interested in engaging on those issues. So it's not as though Muslims have abandoned each other necessarily. It's more about a political and economic system that is structured in such a way to prevent engagement. The last thing I would say is that the U.S. has a long history of intervening in other places in extra legal ways that countervene sovereignty. And the narrative from the left that has said that this is simply a CIA plot, or it's misinformation from the CIA, it's all funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. That, I think, feeds some people's suspicions that this is simply made up, that it's not really happening. And that's unfortunate. one of the things that I think needs to happen going forward is that Uyghurs need to develop autonomous organizations that are not funded by U.S. government sources or by outside government sources like the Defense Department or State Department. Uyghurs are a small minority in diaspora. They have very few institutions, very few sources of funding. And so if a US government source offers funding, like, they're going to take it. Many Uyghurs would tell me, beggars can't be choosers, that sort of thing. And they also, some Uyghurs see the US as the major power that can stand up to China. And so they want the US to stand up to China. It's difficult. As a leftist myself, it's hard to know how you intervene in that community if people have that kind of reactive, they're taking that sort of reactive position. But it's also understandable. If this was my family members that were taken, like, I would want any government to intervene that could. And so it makes sense that that's how people think about it. I think there is hope that there will be a Uyghur left at some point. There's number of young Uyghurs, especially college students, people that are now in sort of junior scholarship positions that are, have that sort of training and are thinking from that perspective. The difficulty for many of them is that they can't speak out openly because their family members are back in China, and if they speak in a public way about what's happening, then they worry that their family members will be targeted. So it makes it very hard to organize from the left. The people that, Uyghurs that are fighting on the right, many of them have simply given up on protecting their family members because their family members have all been taken already. So that's part of what stands in the way of building more solidarity from the left.
Great, thanks. I also just wanted to say that I find it interesting how Tankies will selectively believe certain Muslim nations like Saudi Arabia, for example. So they'll constantly make them out to be every single Arab Spring revolution is funded by the Saudis. It's a plot to turn the country into an Islamic state and so on, and blame the Saudis for everything. And then they'll go, oh, but the Saudis said that there's no oppression happening in China. So, they're a Muslim nation. Why don't we believe them? And so there's this kind of, I think it's also ironic how they're trying to make out the Uyghurs to be funded by the Saudis to have this CIA plot, but the Saudis support China's policy. So how does that work? And you would think that these leftists who claim to be appalled by Saudi Arabia's war in Yemen, and with good reason, it is definitely very awful what the Saudis are doing there. And they don't find it suspicious that the Saudis are then also supporting China's policy. They don't. I don't know, that doesn't seem to bother them. Okay, so I guess my next question is why is it that you think that the two largest anti-war movements in the West, I'm talking about Stop the War Coalition and Code Pink, are both working together to deny the atrocities in Xinjiang?
Right. I mean, that's a kind of unfortunate, I think, secondary effect of what's already ongoing with the way that the gray zone and another sort of anonymous group called Qiang, which is made up ostensibly, or at least according to their own statements, by Chinese nationals living abroad. They're the ones that have really been attacking the numbers, saying that Adrian Zenz is working for the CIA and is or is a fundamentalist Christian, and so it can't be believed, that sort of thing. And they're often invited, because they're on the left, they're sometimes invited into forums where these other two groups that you just mentioned are also present. So that's, I think, how the information is actually transferred. So I don't think that Code Pink or Stop the War, that they have a lot of knowledge of what's happening on the ground in China. Not that Gray Zone does either, but Gray Zone kind of pretends that it does. So I think that they're basically kind of doing a secondary form of propaganda or disinformation that's based on the disinformation they're receiving from these other sources. I think probably what's motivating them is not wanting to deny genocide necessarily, or crimes against humanity, or an internment camp system, whatever you want to call what's happening to the Uyghurs and Kazakhs. But I think it's actually more closely a response, or more fully a response to the Trump administration, to the U.S., U.S.'s position relative to China. The U.S., has taken a sort of new Cold War stance relative to China, mostly through a trade war with China. And along with that, they've also, U.S. officials in the current administration have directly targeted on Chinese people. They associate the coronavirus with China all the time. They talk about Chinese international students as being spies. They're fostering all kinds of racism against Chinese people. And so I think that's what Code Pink and Stop the War Coalition is really interested in mitigating, is those sort of harmful forms of racism that are being fostered by the current administration. And they also, I think, want to, encourage alliances between China and the U.S., which I also think should happen. I think we should have more dialogue. I think that, stopping what's happening to the Uyghurs actually has to come from inside China. And so we need to engage with international students and have them take, more of a leadership role in pushing back against this system, which is very difficult because, China is an authoritarian state that punishes anyone who stands in the way, whether they're Han or Uyghur or any other ethnicity. And at the same time, Code Pink and these other groups, Chiang and well, Chiang probably knows, but the Gray Zone, they believe that China is a communist state, that's sort of a socialist utopia, which is just counterfactual in every way. It's an authoritarian, state capitalist economy that certainly favors elites and punishes people that are not in positions of power. The sort of income inequality gap in China is one of the worst in the world. It's like the highest number of billionaires in the world. We're talking about a capitalist state in almost every aspect of life. But some people on the left are, refuse to see that. And so I think that's part of the issue as well, is that there's a lot of ignorance when it comes to understanding what China is actually doing. And then there's, a sort of reflexive anti-imperialist, anti-American position that people want to take. And so they're willing to, not actually examine what China is doing.
Okay, great. Thanks very much. So I guess we've already kind of covered this somewhat, but I was just wondering, do you think that the Trump administration or people working for it do actually care about the people in this region, or do you think they're purely using it cynically for their own ends?
Well, I think the people that the Trump administration would say are the deep state, some of them, like the people that are sort of career diplomats that actually know a lot about China, that have been part of previous administrations. I think they actually deeply care about what's happening, and they believe the reporting, they believe the evidence that's been shown to be true, and I think they feel like this is something that has to that demands a response. And I think it's not only Xinjiang, but also what's happening in Hong Kong, what could happen in Taiwan, that's motivating them as well. I think they see a sort of resurgent China or a surging China that is really kind of flexing its power in new ways. I think because of the vacuum that's been left during the Trump administration, because the Trump administration has sort of retreated from the world stage in a lot of ways. And so I think China's seeing an opportunity. So I think there are some people in the administration that genuinely care. There's also many, especially the sort of political appointees and people that are actual politicians, that are using this for kind of strategic advantage. And these are people like, Marco Rubio, Ted Cruz, or Mike Pompeo. They, I don't think, care at all really about Uyghurs. I mean, I shouldn't say that for sure. Like, Marco Rubio might be schizophrenic enough to, on one hand care for some Muslims and at the other hand, be totally in favor of banning all other Muslims. I don't know. But their track record shows that in general, they don't care about refugees. They don't care about people that are in serious crisis. And so based on their track record, I can't say that I can believe them when they say they care about Uyghurs. I think for Marco Rubio, who's Cuban American and comes from a background that's anti-communist and from a constituency that's anti-communist, I think for him it plays very well to take up the position of anti-China. And then for someone like Mike Pompeo, who's really invested in sort of a Christian fundamentalist worldview, he frames this around religious freedom, that Uyghurs should be free to practice their faith, which is fine, I agree. But he's very selective in which groups should be able to practice their faith and which ones shouldn't. He also supports Muslim bans otherwise, totally illogical and immoral. I think, people that are in leadership on the left, like someone like Ilhan Omar, who's the most prominent Muslim American political leader, who's taken a very strong stance in support of the Uyghurs. I believe her absolutely, that she actually cares about this, that she sees this as analogous to what's happening to Palestinians, happening to Kashmiris, that Islamophobia is global, and that it takes on these different forms in these different states, and it should be opposed in every form. So that's I think my response. I think if we have a different administration, I think there will be actually a more robust response, a more honest response to what's happening to the Uyghurs. I can't say that it will necessarily, produce the changes that we want, but I think it will push in the right direction. The next steps that have to be taken is that the U.S. has to build coalitions with other nations. There needs to be a broader grassroots movement of labor activists who are opposed to forced labor, people in the technology community who want to oppose forms of coercive surveillance. We need more kind of a grassroots groundswell that pushes back against this.
I think that, even if the Trump administration or whichever Western government are cynically using this issue, that doesn't change the situation on the ground. I think Tankie's trying to draw a false dichotomy between Trump and the Chinese government. If people like you who criticize the Chinese government, they assume that you must be, or they try and make you out to be pro-Trump when, you're clearly not. And, there are the Uyghur Solidarity campaign for the UK, one of their slogans is something like no to Xi and no to Trump. No to Washington or Beijing. So it's easy if that's your issue, is you don't want to be pro-Trump by saying something about the Chinese Communist Party, then that shouldn't concern you. Lots of groups who are protesting on this issue are very anti-Trump too, and say that openly.
Right.
But I think one thing that we spoke about when we were talking about Twitter is you wanted to make it very clear that there is a very clear distinction between the Chinese government and the Chinese people. And that's one thing that the Trump in particular will try and mash together, but they are separate.
Right, exactly. So the people that are carrying out this campaign are people in leadership. They're the ones that have started the campaign, that want to extend state power, their own power over people. And they're also working with corporate leaders. So the people that are running that built the camps, that are running the factories that are associated with the camps, that are not paying their workers, that are benefiting directly from forced labor, from the camp system, that are treating Uyghurs and Kazakhs like some kind of like a permanent underclass of unfree workers. They are the ones that we should really be targeting, not regular Chinese folks. As many Chinese people don't really understand what's happening in Xinjiang, especially if they're not from Xinjiang. There's very limited information that they can access freely about this, and most information they get about Xinjiang is coming from the state, and they're saying that this is a benefit for the Uyghurs, this is poverty alleviation, we're doing a much better job than the West in fighting war on terror, that it was an Islamist hotbed, and so we had to do something, we're actually protecting you. Those are the messages people get. And they don't really understand that families are being torn apart in such a significant way. That innocent people have been sent to the camps in very large numbers. I think if they had full access to that knowledge, they would have a different response. And so I think we have to give them the benefit of the doubt to some extent. We also have to understand that, China is an immense country that has a huge population. 600 million people are living on $140 a month. They're in pretty extreme forms of poverty. And we can't expect them to necessarily take up a sort of liberal political stance on this, take to the streets and demand Uyghur rights. Like, they have other issues that they're contending with in their own lives. And the trade war with China is hurting them very directly. And so that's one of the reasons why, if we do have sanctions or more moratoriums on trade with China in certain ways, it should be very, very targeted towards what's happening in these camps, what's happening in the factories associated with them, and should not be a blanket sanctions on China as a whole. It should be a response to very specific issues on the ground. And so going forward, every administration and every citizen should disassociate what's happening to the Uyghurs, for what's happening in the political system in China, from those sort of everyday life experiences of common people in China. And we should be very generous to the Chinese people we meet. I think there's perhaps some that could use what's happening to the Uyghurs as a way of sort of racializing Chinese people as a whole and saying, oh, these people are all monsters because they're doing this to the Uyghurs. It's not them that is doing it. It's a group of people, a group of leaders, a group of people that are working in government, working in these factories in Northwest China that are responsible. And there is some responsibility in other parts of China, but we have to have a nuanced view of it. And racism should always be opposed in any form.
Okay. I think one thing I find it pretty interesting, that one aspect of this issue that is ignored by tankies and leftists is the extent to which what's happening in China right now is informed by the US war on terror or by Israeli counter-terrorist strategy. I was wondering if you could speak a little bit about that.
Yeah, so one of the things that I've written about is the way that policing theorists in China, when they were beginning to think about how they should respond to what was happening in Xinjiang, to violent incidents, to changes in people's appearance. They thought that because people were dressing in ways that looked more Muslim to them, people were praying more, that was a sign of them becoming extremists. In fact, what they were interested in is just very normal forms of Islamic piety, Hanafi school, Sunni Islam. They were exposed to it in greater numbers because they had access to the internet for the first time in around 2011. And so they became part of social networks with people living abroad, and they saw, oh, this is how Muslims live in other places. And so they started to practice in similar ways. The state conflated that with like, oh, this is pre-terrorism because they look this way, therefore they must, the next step will be they're going to attack civilians or something. There was no evidence to show for that. But people were very concerned by it. And so what the policing theorists thought is they said, well, we should look at what they're doing in Israel to combat this, what they're doing in the UK, what does the PREVENT program do? What does the CVE program, which is Countering Violent Extremism program, do in the US? And they had actually already been thinking about counterinsurgency theory when it comes to militarization. It's a kind of using information or surveillance as a tool in doing precise warfare, which is what the Petraeus, it's called the Petraeus doctrine, was using in Iraq when they occupied Iraq. To map the Muslim populations in Iraq to decide who they should detain, who was an insurgent or not. And they actually built camps in Iraq for detainees. That's kind of the term detainee really comes from the Iraq War. Um, and so they put lots of people in camps, including the future leaders of the Islamic State. But the important part of that was they were trying to like map the entire population to figure out, you know, who is part of what group, who's related to whom. They needed total information. And initially that was hard because it was 2007, people weren't using smartphones yet. But by 2011 in China, everyone was using a smartphone. They had also, you know, seen the Snowden revelations that showed that the NSA in the US was tracking everyone's social media, or could track everyone's social media. And so they started doing the same thing. Like they said that very directly after there was a large incident at a train station in Kunming in China, where Uyghurs attacked on civilians and killed over 30. You know, the leaders of several large companies in China said, okay, we're going to do the same thing that Google and Amazon and other companies in the US are doing to track people's behavior online and supply that to the police. And so that's what they started to do. So they started with that kind of counterinsurgency approach, but then they moved to the CVE approach, or prevent approach, which is about preventative policing, which is like stopping the crime before it happens. So if you see something, say something. That's the slogan in the US at least. But in the UK, it was about, you know, getting teachers to report on their students, getting imams to report on people that came to their mosque, you know, who's looking like they're radicalizing, you know, stop them from going to Syria before they go to Syria, that sort of thing. And so they took that approach in China as well, but they said they were going to use Chinese characteristics to do it, which meant that they were going to use sort of community level policing in every neighborhood. And so they divided the whole region into grids. And then they began to assess the population as a whole to figure out who was trustworthy, who was untrustworthy, who was normal or average. And because they set the parameters so wide that anyone who prayed, anyone who had a beard, anyone who had downloaded WhatsApp, which is encrypted and so therefore is dangerous, anyone who used a VPN, anyone who had books in their home that were, you know, about Islam or about Uyghur history, like all of those people were considered potentially terrorists or pre-criminal, depending on how much they had of those materials. And so they began to use all these tools to assess people and decide who should be sent to the camps. And the camp system itself is something that's sort of native to China. It's something that, but many places have used camps. I mean, we have camps everywhere, refugee camps, asylum-seeking camps here in the US. But in China, they've used camps to target political dissidents in the past during the Cultural Revolution, and more recently for the Falun Gong folks. And the reason why we need to call them camps is because they're not given a criminal charge. They're just simply placed into this space for indefinite detention. So there's a combination of like this Chinese approach to policing and controlling populations, and then this new sort of technology-driven approach, which comes from the US and Europe and Israel, that uses checkpoints and surveillance. And the authority of the technology is then used to decide if the person should be put in the camp.
Thanks. So I guess my final question is, I sent you a video by Mario Cavallo at the Center for China and Globalization, and he's responding specifically to the argument that you can see in Chinese government figures that the birth rate for Uyghurs is rapidly dropping, and that's a sign that there's forced sterilizations in camps and so on. And he's arguing in this video that the dropping birth rates are really just because China's economic development is increasing, so Uyghurs don't feel the need to have as many children, and also that the Han birth rate is also dropping, so it's nothing specific to the Uyghur population. So I was wondering how you respond to that argument.
Well, he's obviously not looked at the government stats from Xinjiang, because if you look at them, you can see very directly that the Uyghur majority areas in Xinjiang, which are prefectures like Khotan and Kashgar, have seen just, you know, dramatic decreases in birth rate and in population growth over the last 3 years. Like, it's just undeniable. It's so obviously there. what if you scale out and you look at Xinjiang as a whole, and then you're including all these Han majority areas, then you're going to see, a less dramatic change over time. But if you look at those specific areas, it's just startling. And then you can also see, dramatic increases in sterilization and IUDs in those regions too. So the important thing is to look really specifically at these Uyghur majority areas, especially the ones that are most heavily targeted with camps, with the education system, with forced labor. I think one of the important things is to keep in mind is that a lot of what's causing the decrease in birth rate and population growth is not, directly from sterilization or IUDs, but is from family separation, because parents are being separated from each other, either by factories or sent to camps. And also many people have left the region because the Han people have left the region because it's hard to do sort of the economic work that they were doing in the past under the current circumstances because of the security system. So anyway, that's, I think, some of the dynamics that we have to keep in mind.
Okay, great. Well, I think that's all the questions I have. So thanks very much for joining me today, Darren. Thanks for taking the time to speak to me. It's been very nice to have you on.
Well, great. It was an honor to be here. Hopefully this will, get some answers to people that are looking for them about how to sort of respond to some of these talking points.
Absolutely. All right. Well, thanks very much. I guess it's 9 a.m. in Seattle, or around 10 now. So I'll give you have a good rest of your day.
Okay. Thanks. Same to you.
Bye. Thanks very much.
Okay. Bye.